Thank you very much, everyone, for coming tonight, especially given that it's such a beautiful day and there are competing other presentations for your interest. And thank you, Georg, for an excellent introduction. I think you've really given a really good overview of where I come from, what my background is, and also the different disciplinary perspectives that I bring to the work that I do in relation specifically to climate change and to environmental change as well. And I'd also like to thank Irene and THESys very much for having me here today and inviting me to talk and interact with you as well. The presentation, if you like, or the talk that I would like to give today will cover a range of different aspects that I've dealt with over time in relation to my work. And I'd like specifically to focus on some projects, recent and ongoing, that we've got developing to illustrate in part some of the kind of interdisciplinary nature of the work that I do, but also the different angles through which we have explored issues relating to climate change, to environmental change, and some manifestations of that, like, for example, flooding. First of all, something that really strikes me quite notably in the way that I do my work and in the way that I teach my students as well is this kind of real emphasis internationally and in the UK as well on climate change, but also the very different framings that climate change is being given. And to illustrate an example of that, I've put here different headlines from different newspapers. So this one was in 2011 from The Guardian in the UK, an article reporting how the International Energy Agency was really warning about the immediacy of climate change and the idea of getting forwards with mitigation negotiations. On the other hand, you have the international negotiations also focusing specifically on adaptation and providing assistance to countries, structural funds, climate change funds, in order to be able to deal with some of the more immediate impacts, as I said, in relation to adaptation. But again, here you have a polar bear symbolizing, for example, climate change. And of course, something that's been in the media quite recently and is very controversial, the idea of geoengineering or managing some of our atmosphere and the phenomena that happen in order to try and reduce, again, the effect that our emissions might have on the climate as a whole. And again, here you see the characterization of polar bears really trying to heavily do something about it. So this notion, perhaps, that a climate change is going to affect some vulnerable communities, maybe the natural world, something that perhaps we have some affinity with, but is partly removed, is something that we think about, but is partly removed for us. So the context of a lot of my research is this growing international acceptance of climate change, although, of course, there's quite a lot of controversy around it, there's skepticism around it, and so on. Those are other elements that we can talk about, but they're not the focus of my talk today. The responses, as we said, this mitigation, adaptation, sometimes the presentation, especially in the scientific literature, of these as being two different strands, potentially individual and going in different directions, requiring different measures and different responses. And of course, the implications that would be really quite profound from any of these kind of actions and responses that we might take. The implications that those might have on society and on individuals in terms of the choices, the behaviours that we might enact, why we might try to do that within the context that we operate in, the relevance for those societal structures and governance structures as well that we live within day to day, and the potential there for change. So, a lot of the psychological literature, which I partly draw on in some of my work, talks about engagement with climate change. And again, focusing this very much on an individual level in terms of thinking about how people might connect with a particular issue or with a particular element that's very much the forefront of scientific research. And has been defined a different way, it's used in a variety of different ways, and we wrote about it as well a few years ago, and we defined it as a link with climate change comprising cognitive, affective, and behavioral aspects. So an emotional link, a rational link, if you like, in terms of understanding, but also an aspect there of doing something about it. So some of the work that I've been carried out is trying to understand to what extent are publics engaged with climate change. And here I talk about publics in the kind of broader sense of the word, in terms of acknowledging that people are very different, they're not homogeneous, we can't standardize in terms of the way that individuals and society relate to this phenomenon. But also more importantly is, does an understanding of climate change influence people's responses? And then towards the end of my talk, I'd like to bring up this issue of unusual or disruptive or extreme events. Does that direct experience have an element of influence in the way people respond to what is called and what is termed a really urgent but global phenomenon? How is it interpreted at the local scale? And does it have some bearing then on how potential change happens in terms of that response? So as an initial overview, we can look at some of the work that's been done in terms of trying to assess on a very generic level how people might relate to climate change. And this is data from a Gallup poll in 2010 looking at how people in different countries think of climate change as a potential threat. And what you can see here is that there's really quite a lot of difference between the different parts of the world that have been agglomerated into these very generic and quite extensive geographical areas. But also there's, towards the end of the table, a more distinct subdivision and presentation of percentage of individuals in particular nation states. And what is really quite interesting is that there seems to be a growing perception of climate change as a threat in some of the developing nations, some parts of Africa, some parts of Asia, some parts of Latin America as well, whereas that perception, if you like, of climate change as a threat tends to be reducing or scaling down in parts of the Western world. There are some issues here with some of the data. Some of the differences are should be taken as a pinch of salt, if you like, in the sense that there were a small number of respondents related to this. But it paints an interesting picture for us to try and question why these differences might be arising, and also whether there are any artifacts in illuminating this data through the methods that have been used here in terms of collecting data through surveys. Here's another interesting example, more focused on this part of the world, and it's taken from a special Eurobarometer that was run in 2013 and published last year. And this asked European respondents in the 28 European Union countries, which of the following do you consider to be the single most serious problem facing the world as a whole? And here, highlighted in this box, is the issue of climate change. So it's quite interesting that in terms of seriousness, in whichever way the respondents might have interpreted that, climate change is amongst the top three, with about between 16 and 20% of people saying that. The blue bar is the survey of 2013, and it's compared against a very similar survey of 2011. The highest proportions of people suggesting it was a serious issue are those represented in that chart that I've put there at the bottom in dark blue that you can see here. And so it's mainly the Scandinavian countries and the Central European countries which had a percentage of over 20%. So again, that gives you a flavour for how different it is that different groups around the world are thinking about climate change, and the diversity of responses that you can really get with quite simple questions, such as this one being asked. So again, we're starting to get an idea of how different publics are and why it is that they might have different views around climate change. This is going much more in focus towards Britain, and it shows you a line drawing together different surveys, data from different surveys, asking very similar questions in relation to concern around climate change. And it represents respondents in Britain saying that they were fairly or very concerned about climate change. And what you can notice here is a general trend very similar to those I have shown you before, where there is a bit of a decline from the higher interest or concern around climate change in the mid-2000s to a slow decline with a little bit of a blip in the middle around 2012 and 2013. So there is still seemingly amongst publics a real interest in climate change. There seems to be an association with some kind of negativity around climate change, but exactly what that means to people living on the ground and why it is that there might be this concern is also quite interesting. But also, most importantly, how does that affect in any way how they respond to particular changes that they might notice in their environment or that they might be subject to. So the psychological literature and sociological literature says that there seem to be quite clear indications of what might influence people's views on the climate. And generally, it's seen, and quite a lot of review papers have really pointed this out, that people's values about things that they hold dear, but also about the position that they hold in the world and how they position themselves in relation to society is also very important, as well as their personal beliefs about how change occurs and why. Their worldviews are also very influential, so how they see the world around them, how it's structured, but also how it's managed. And especially in the US, and there have been some studies looking at this in the UK as well, their ideology is especially related to political tendency. But one aspect that I want to focus specifically again on this talk is this notion of evidence. Is there anything that happens in the world around people that suggests to them, perhaps, that there might be some link with climate change or not, and how this is interpreted and how this is taken forward? So we've also done some work which relates to climate change thinking about how it might impact other kinds of environment that might not be immediately accessible to people in some cases, or immediately thought of directly as being impacted by climate change. So we carried out a survey with other partners around Europe, asking people through an online survey what they thought about climate change, what they felt the impacts of climate change might be on the coast and the sea, what kind of issues they felt were raised, and most importantly, how they could also be addressed, maybe through policy change. And it was a study of 10 European nations with, again, online surveys in these different countries. And what was really interesting for us to see is that although the sea tends to be an area which not everybody has direct connection with on a day-to-day basis, coastlines are visited by a majority of people, or there are particular tendencies to visit coastlines quite regularly in most of the European countries that we surveyed. So it's not an environment that's removed, it's something that people have some connection with. And interestingly, I think that reflects in some of the analysis of this report, where it shows that people's concern about particular impacts of climate change on the coastline and the sea are higher, they tend to be higher than their self-assessed level of informedness. So you can see this in the graph. The dotted line represents the one-to-one line, and the position that these different environmental impacts have is much higher than that dotted line. So it indicates that people tend to be much more concerned than they feel informed about these particular issues. So the emotive aspect, the affective aspect, is really coming out from these data. We also asked people what kind of environmental matters they associated with the coastline and the sea. And this graph is now from the same survey, but it only represents data from the UK as a whole. So the UK was one of the countries that was studied as part of this online survey. And we asked people at the very beginning of the survey to give us, in an open elicitation, what 3 environmental issues they associated with it. So that's why you get the different coloured bars. The green one is the first elicitation, so the words or the group of words that people provided in the first instance. The red ones are those that they provided in the second instance, and the blue ones in the third instance. And what is really interesting here is that you can see coastal erosion emerging quite strongly. That tends to be an issue for parts of the UK, quite serious issues in some cases. Pollution and oil pollution, which emerged as quite distinct categories from our coding of the data, and sea level rise. So some of those are elements that you might associate with climate change or with a changing environmental nature, like coastal erosion, for instance, but others are very much related to human-made activities. And an interesting component that we had as part of this project was that we held a one-day participatory workshop on the North Norfolk coast in one part of the UK, where we asked people to come together, debate with scientists what some of the issues were in relation to climate change, and think about how they related to that particular sea environment where they were at. And what emerged really quite clearly was that people saw the environmental issues as very integrated. They did not distinguish specifically between climate change impacts and other forms of human-made impacts on the coastline. But also very interesting, they didn't disassociate those two responses to climate change and to mitigation and adaptation, which tends to be quite a strong scientific dichotomy. For most people, they said, well, it makes sense from a sustainability perspective to look after our environment and also to think about our environment in a much more integrated way. There are elements that we don't know whether they could be attributed to our human impact or to climate change in the longer term, like new fishes coming in or fishermen seeing a decline in particular fish species and so on. But it actually tends to make sense if we think about the impact overall that we as human beings are having on our environment. So this kind of evidence and the immediacy of particular habitats or particular landscapes and the relationship that people have with those emerge really, really strongly from that qualitative work that we did that does not transpire from this survey. But it served to link up with some of the survey responses that we had and create a fuller understanding of what we were trying to understand about impacts of climate change on the coast and the sea. So in relation to evidence of particular environmental changes or changes to the environment, another strand of work which we've been focusing on has been the relationship between people's understanding of extreme events and the responses that they provide to these extreme events. And of course, extreme events, and especially the UK has been beset by them over the past year and a half, tend to acquire greater societal significance. And scientists and climatologists would say that these are going to become increasingly more frequent as climate change becomes more evident. And it's been argued that actually societal and institutional response to those events could also take form of adaptation. But a lot of the work on adaptation has looked at potentially incremental adaptation, low-level changes that and slow ones over a longer period of time, trying to assess whether that can actually build, or those responses can build resilience to climate change in the long term, and potentially maintain some of the societal systems, some of the societal structures, and also landscapes in a similar form to what they are before. But there's some new literature emerging that actually argues that maybe we need to think about transformational change and think about the fact that if we're going to observe increasingly disruptive changes in the future and increasingly kind of increasingly frequent but also extreme events in the sense of their magnitude, then maybe actually we need to think about something more radical in terms of being able to adapt our societies to those kind of more pressing changes. And perhaps that requires some kind of transformation. And actually, the IPCC talks about transformation in its recent report, and it defines transformation as a process of adjustment. And it talks separately about human systems and natural systems. And that's something that emerges from research as being, again, quite different in the sense that there are very strong interlinkages between, obviously, those natural systems and the human systems that inhabit those. And the IPCC itself makes this distinction between incremental adaptation and transformational adaptation. So in light of what I've been saying already about the relevance of evidence, the relevance of its interpretation, and then responses to immediate but also longer term effects, what does that mean? Well, some have argued that actually we need to promote long-term resilience, but we already know that experience, that perceptions and expectations really make a difference in terms of how people perceive climate change. So my question would be, do these extreme events and these disturbances, these unusual events, do they lead to some form of change? Change, I mean, not only to the landscape, but the way that individuals respond to these changes, the way potentially they associate them with climate change, and also potentially structural responses, societal responses, and perhaps policy responses too. So to try and illustrate that, I'd like to bring in and refer to some other kind of work that I've done with other people. And two different pieces, one more recent, which I'm illustrating here, and one that was undertaken a few years back. So we were funded to do some work on the North Norfolk coast. And this is a piece of land which is here in this purple square, and it's on the north coast of an area called East Anglia, and the county is called Norfolk. Now, that area is really very interesting in terms of its natural habitat, but also it's got small communities and villages who have lived there for some time. It's also very appealing to people from outside who have moved into the area really quite recently, again, partly because it's of its natural habitat characteristics, but also because of its quality of life. So this area, alongside with quite a lot of the rest of East Anglia and part of the North Sea as well, was affected by a storm surge in December 2013. There was a depression over the North Sea, and there was a very high tide coupled with very strong wind, which meant that the tide rose very substantially and the winds pushed the water inland. And so all of that area was affected by flooding and was affected by really severe disruption, which I'll show you in a minute. And as a consequence, as a one-off event, it created an interesting opportunity to try and understand what it is that people and the natural habitat made of that extreme event, and how people have responded over time. So we undertook 12 in-depth interviews with policy and decision makers there, and we also did 4 focus groups with members of the public or publics in a small village called Blakeney. And we also undertook some face-to-face surveys with people in that area after the event. And so I'd like to run through with you what this area constitutes, because it's important to understand what its characteristics are in order to understand also what kind of responses featured there. So again, this is a shingle spit, so it's made from shingle, lots of stones of varying nature that extends all along this coastline. And there is a river that you can see here, probably, the Blakeney River, which has its outlet into the sea from here and runs along this way. It's been constrained since late medieval times. It used to be a big port with big ships sailing all over Europe, but it was closed in order to create a more favourable habitat for certain conditions and for certain types of boats as well. There's a small village called Blakeney Village, which is down here that you can see, and also another small village around here called Cly. What's really interesting is that, again, in the 1800s, this area had a wall built around it, and it's called Blakeney Freshers. It has some natural springs in it, so it's fed only by fresh water, and it's grazed as well. And this area over here is a natural reserve area, Clyde Marshes. Again, it has some freshwater springs, so most of the habitat that you find here is freshwater marsh in part, and it's internationally designated. Both areas have international designations under the Habitats Directive. So after the storm, there was a huge disruption to the small quayside in Blakeney. There was also a fair amount of damage to this wall. There were 34, I think, breaches to this wall, which meant that the water overflowed. And then there was also two big gaps in the shingle ridge on that side, which meant that the water came in and overtopped, in part, that shingle barrier, and again made these two areas, the Freshers and the Clyde Marshes, saline for a limited amount of time. So this is what happened on the night of the storm between the 5th and the 6th of December 2013. That defence that I showed you around Blakeney Freshers was completely overtopped by the water. So the river and the quayside are usually here, but as you can see, all these boats have been dragged by the water over the sea defence, and all the water has gone into here, which are the Blakeney Freshers, the freshwater marshes. The next day, you can see that the water is present both in this area and in this area. They're not supposed to be the sea. This is just supposed to be the marshes and the quayside near Blakeney, and these are supposed to be the freshwater marshes, but they've all been inundated by the water from the sea. And these are the big holes that were left in the sea defence. They were eroded by the water as it came over, and then apparently also eroded and scoured by the water as it was in the Freshers too. And just to give you another example, this is the aerial view of that land. This is, again, Blakeney Freshers, all inundated by saline water. This is the sea, and this is where the river usually emits out to the sea or flows out to the sea. And this is Clyde Marshes, again, with patches that have been invaded by salt water. And here you can see one of the breaches in the shingle. So the water overtopped the barrier and apparently made its way out by scouring the shingle in this way and created these two big breaches. Now, a very interesting event was that the two breaches remarginalised themselves. I think it was about a month and a half after the storm event. And that was something that the scientists and some of the other organisations that oversee the management of that landscape had not foreseen in their entirety. This shingle barrier is something that's existed for a very long period of time, but this idea of breaches remarginalising themselves was very new, and that was something really quite unexpected. People already thought, oh, we need to intervene here, we need to protect the land that's behind, we need to make sure that we can drain all the water out in some kind of way and make sure artificially that those gaps are closed, but actually sea processes on themselves facilitated that and did close those breaches, very much to the relief of everybody else. So again, that was a very interesting feature, something that few people would have projected. There was some kind of inkling that it might happen, but the fact that it did really surprised everybody. So in terms of the work that we did then, we asked people what their experience had been of this event, how they felt it related to the existing policy, but also how they felt it might relate to climate change, and whether they felt that there was any ammunition there in terms of creating opportunities for also individual and social learning within the organisations involved in managing that part of the coastline. And so we asked questions specifically around this, and these were the ones that we did propose to some of those stakeholders. Here is a colleague of mine showing you the level that the water reached in Blakeney in 2013 at the time of this storm, And here are some other markers on the wall indicating the water levels at other periods in time. So it's not new to have flooding in that area. That has happened very much before. And of course, 1953 was a disastrous flood that affected other parts of the North Sea very seriously as well. But an indication there that flooding and invasion, if you like, of some of the human habitats by the sea is not entirely new. And people have managed to cope with it over periods of time. So here I've extracted some quotes relative to decision makers and public's views around what that event indicated, specifically relating to climate change. And this decision maker in particular said, well, we can't attribute any particular event to climate change, but this kind of event is what we expect is going to be more likely, which I think makes it quite difficult for our communication of events like this with the public. I think there's a fear of doing that in the sense that it becomes politicized. Climate change is a politicized issue at the moment. So there's this notion amongst policymakers that climate change is an important feature to take into account in policy decisions, and in driving that in relation to communication and engagement with publics, but sometimes it's incredibly difficult to do so, and it can't necessarily be associated with particular events, even if they have some dramatic consequences for the areas where people live in. We also asked policymakers whether they felt that anything specifically had been learned from this particular event. And this one interviewee said, well, a special event makes everybody interested. People think, actually, this is unusual. What have we done about it, and what are the changes we've learned from it? He questioned that, and he, at that point in time, had some time to think about it. And similarly to the previous interviewee, he said, well, nobody can say it's climate change, but it's these type of events that are predicted to become more frequent. Learning to cope with it is important for us, and pre-planning for it. So again, this notion that it's important to bear climate change issues in mind and the potential change that they can create for the future, but bringing climate change forward into the present and linking it to a particular extreme event can prove very difficult from a decision-making and a policy-making perspective. We then had discussions with publics in Blakeney, in that village that I showed you before, and the views on climate change there were really quite different. People said, well, yes, there's a likelihood that a lot of the coastline will disappear, you know, talking ahead hundreds of years, I don't know how many years. And it's interesting yet, noticing that and relating it to the fact that that environmental change in the coastline of that area has always happened over time. It's a very evolving and natural evolving coast. And some people said, okay, climate change will exacerbate the effects of erosion and flooding. So some kind of notion that perhaps, yes, there will be some kind of effect, but again, a tenuous link there. And one person kind of reiterated perhaps what one of the decision makers had said earlier. Some politicians would use climate change as an excuse for not doing something, for not spending money, because it's too expensive, too difficult. So again, the political nature of climate change and the potential difficulty of justifying some decisions in relation to climate change as opposed to something else was something that came across quite strongly. Two of the focus groups that we did were with people that were very keen on conservation and on the natural areas that are present and around Cley. And it was interesting that they also felt that with that particular extreme event, there was only a tenuous link to climate change. So you can see that in the first quote, the storm surge had nothing to do with climate change. Or the second one, I think it would be very hard to make the link with climate change. And he said, we don't blame climate change for the 1953 event, so perhaps, you know, what evidence is there that we can blame the current one on that? And the last quote actually says, well, the salt marshes seem to be accreting, they are keeping ahead of it. So perhaps there is some element of climate change already manifesting, but it seems to be okay. There doesn't seem to be a serious pressing issue here dealing with it. We also asked people about whether there would be opportunities emerging from this event. And what was really nice among some policy and decision makers is that there is a chance here to think really proactively about what the future holds. And this respondent said, well, we need to build something at Blakeney, Cley and everywhere that is future-proofed, adaptive, resilient, ecologically robust, but which builds coastal process function and change into the solution. And so they were saying, well, actually, we need to think about these processes as they evolve. We need to think about what the future might hold and think about chances, perhaps, of doing something differently or being able to adapt in order to be better able to deal with future changes that come into the future. And something that I forgot to tell you is that eventually funding was received by the UK government and administered partly by the Environment Agency to fill the gaps in that wall around Blakeney Freshers that I showed you. And there was quite a lot of debate and discussion about whether the bank should be rebuilt at all, whether perhaps a more adaptive solution would have been to leave it breached and slowly get those marshes to become saltwater marshes again and perhaps protect some of the area surrounding them. And eventually the solution, partly because of the international importance of that habitat ecologically, the wall was rebuilt, but it was rebuilt at a lower level than before, and it was rebuilt with a wider profile, with the idea that if other storms occurred, it would be much more resistant to scouring and it potentially wouldn't breach as it had done before. Our interviewees were ambivalent about those options. Some of them said, well, it would be nice to have the wall rebuilt, but if it's lower, it kind of gives me a sense of insecurity now. What do I get from that new feature that is there? But the value in terms of economy, in terms of ecology, and in terms of livelihoods to the people living there was really, really high. That came across from a lot of the discussions that the Environment Agency held with them. On the other hand, we also asked some other interviewees, well, had there been any learning from this extreme event? Was there anything specifically that seemed to suggest that maybe policy would become a little bit more adaptive and take account of these considerations? But this interview in particular said, well, the fact that the sea defences have been reinstated, the fact that the line, if you like, of the coastline has been held as it was before, so holding the line, means that no learning has taken place. It seems that everything's reverted back to what it was before. So there are very different opinions here about what an extreme event can represent in terms of change, in terms of adaptation and potentially transformational adaptation, but also what it means in terms of how different institutions and organizations interpret that and how they link to future potential changes like climate change. Now, finally, I'd like to just talk briefly about another piece of work in relation to flooding. And again, this is quite different. It relates to a different theoretical perspective, which is very much emergent from philosophy and which revolves around social contracts. And the notion that there is potentially commitment between civil society and the state in terms of outlining the rights and the responsibilities of all the parties that are within this commitment in order to manage change and in order to manage risks that might arise to these different parties. And some of the literature on social contracts suggests that they actually evolve over time. They are renegotiated, potentially in response to particular events, and potentially, and also in relation to how the role of these different actors in the social contract evolves. So the question then is, if there is environmental change and potentially increasing environmental change in the future with an input of climate change, what does this relationship and negotiation say between different actors in relation to how environmental change is managed, but also how it is perceived by the different actors that are part of this contract? And might it have an effect, again, on these responses in terms of adaptation and perhaps increasing resilience? And this is from a paper that Neil Adler and several of us wrote together relating to a specific project that we undertook in two parts in two locations. One in Cumbria, I'll show you in a minute, in the north west of the UK, and in Galway, also in the west of Ireland. We looked at policy documents and discourses, and we undertook some household surveys with individuals in both locations, both flooded and non-flooded. And we asked people about how they had perceived the event, who they felt was responsible for dealing with the event, who potentially had an option of putting in place potential recovery options, and how they felt about the future. And importantly, there were issues here related to fairness and to social justice. So what elements here of the way that people felt about effects that had influenced them related to associations or to expectations of certain deliveries and to the way that others had been treated as well. So we chose these two areas, which are actually, here, circled in red. The first one in dark blue around here is a region called Cumbria, as I said, in northwest of England, and here is Galway in the west of Ireland. Those two areas were affected in 2009, at the end of 2009, by very, very strong winds and very, very intense rainfall. Return periods of those events that affected these two areas were calculated to be about 1,000 years in Galway and about 2,000 in Cumbria. So really very, very severe events. And a lot of those communities were flooded or experienced flooding or had people that they knew that were flooded. And in Cumbria specifically, and maybe you might have heard of it, there was a lot of disruption. There were a lot of, there was a village where the bridge, for example, fell down, where communication was impossible for several days, where people had to go hugely long distances to get to where they needed to, and so on. Now, the important characteristic of this study is that, of course, these are two very different jurisdictions. One of them is within England, one of them is within Ireland. And in the Irish study in this area, the areas that were flooded tended to be mainly new-built homes. Not all of them, but some of the new-built homes were flooded. And so these were people that had bought homes recently in a potentially floodable area and that hadn't experienced flooding before. In Cumbria, the situation was quite different. People had experience of flooding before in most cases. And again, the intervention in most occasions in the past had been through government, partly through some charities, and also in the form of the Environment Agency. So we have two very different contexts here at play. Now, one of the elements that we asked people was, well, how do you see that based on your experience of flooding around 2009, your experience of flooding will increase again in the future? Do you think you will be flooded in the immediate future again based on your experience? And what's really interesting to see here is that in Cumbria, there wasn't any real difference between those who had been flooded in 2009 and those who hadn't in terms of their expectations around flooding in the future. Whereas in Galway, in the west of Ireland, those differences were really notable. Those who were flooded said, yes, it's likely that I'll be flooded again. Those that were not flooded maintained they probably wouldn't be flooded in the future. So the expectations there about how far an event can reach people, what societal impact that might have, and then repercussions for those responses are very different in those two areas. We then also asked people, and here we combine the findings from people who were flooded and non-flooded in Cumbria and Galway. We asked them who they thought the responsibility was for reducing that likelihood of future flooding. And we asked them, do you think it's homeowners who should reduce that likelihood, maybe future-proofing their homes, moving somewhere else, or maybe enacting some other options? Or do you think that is the responsibility of government? And there was no significant difference here in the responses around government. These were overwhelming the majority in both Galway and Cumbria. But you can see here that respondents in Cumbria also felt that they had a higher responsibility to do this than people in Galway. And it's very interesting to relate that to the facts and kind of recollections of the events that people were telling us about in Galway, in relation to the fact that after the flood, they felt that they were really let down by government. They felt that in some cases the response was slow. The fact that charities stepped in and they really helped people out. And the fact that it was also an unforeseen event, something that they hadn't really imagined that they would suffer. Whereas again in Cumbria we have a different set of circumstances whereby that kind of social contract has developed over longer periods of time, and there's more of an understanding of what government and other societal actors can do in relation to flooding. And also, we asked people then, what about your future actions towards dealing with flooding? And we asked people specifically for those that had been flooded and who believed they would be flooded in the future, in the immediate future, whether they would take particular actions. And what you can see here is that, again, those that had had an experience of flooding felt that they would undertake some of these changes. But again, if you like, the willingness or the inclination to do so was higher again in Cumbria with that experience than from those survey respondents that we had in Galway. So again, the notion here is thinking about, okay, how are events mediated by those kind of roles of responsibility that different actors are perceived and expected to have in a particular society, and what do they mean then in relation to how those roles and responsibilities are created or structured in the future, if some of these kind of pressing and quite serious events start affecting people or start affecting particular locations at more regular intervals. So what I think we take from some of this work that's emerging and a lot of other work that's coming from other communities around the world is that potentially these kind of disturbances and direct experience of these disturbances can instigate some form of change. But in what way and when exactly might that change be manifest, again, is very difficult to tell. So I think in the case of the North Norfolk coast, there seems to be a clear indication that, yes, we should be thinking about this in the future, implementing potential responsive options. But how exactly to do that in engagement with other stakeholders, publics, and people who live there is going to be really quite difficult. And again, in relation to Cumbria and Galway again, whether there might be some inclination or some direct manifestation of a changed social contract as a result of those manifestations of flooding is again an open question. So again, there's also a question that's raised in relation to management of natural areas. If there are shifting baselines, so if there are changes that are likely to happen to these natural areas that are, if you like, considered by those actors that have a management responsibility for those areas, but also by individuals and groups and society and social actors with an ownership and a direct engagement with those coastal areas. What does that mean, though, in relation to future changes for those individuals in relation to their well-being and to the way that they might live in the future as well? So that kind of change that happened around Blakeney and Cley was really very controversial. There was so much discussion around what future change might bring and how a present response might be suitable for, again, a future change. I think there's, again, an ongoing negotiation about what responsibility different actors have in society and how the public sphere relates to the private. But again, those kind of changes and their manifestation in some cases seem to be quite slow in terms of being created and in terms of them being implemented. And something that emerged quite strongly again from the work that we did on the Norfolk coast is that value of early engagement. So many of those decision makers and policy makers that we spoke to said we have to keep on relations going with all the people that inhabited the coast and the policy makers that manage this coastline, with a view to creating those relationships of trust, those networks that will enable us to be much more adaptive in response to future change. And the question about learning, which for me is still a very much an open question and which I want to pursue further in relation to theories of learning, social learning and individual learning, but also the question of fairness. And again, this came up very openly in the case of North Norfolk and also this question of flooding in Ireland and the north of England. So I'd also like to thank all the people that have collaborated with me and without which all these projects and this work that I've just talked about would have been really impossible. And so that's really all the people, all my colleagues and friends that we've collaborated with over the years and who have brought together the kind of work and these kind of trajectories that we're embarking on in the future. So thank you very much, and I really appreciate your attention. And if you have any questions, then by all means, do ask. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For this brilliant example of what environment